For more on Chinese President Xi Jinping's special envoy to DPRK visit, we are joined in our Beijing studio Teng Jianqun, who is the director of the American Studies Department at the China Institute of International Studies. In Medford, United States, we have Sung-Yoon Lee, a Kim Koo-Korea Foundation professor of Korean Studies at Fletcher School at the Tufts University. Also joining us in Washington, D.C. in the U.S., Jonathan Pollack, a senior fellow at the Center for East Asia Policy at the Brookings Institution. Gentlemen, I want to welcome the three of you, and let me start with you, Mr. Teng. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has been saying once and again that the Chinese envoy is going to North Korea mainly to brief the counterparts of what's going on at the 19th Party Congress. But many have been wondering, what are some of the important messages when it comes to the nuclear issue on the Korean Peninsula? Mr. Teng, your thought?
Yeah, this is actually a routine visit by the CPC delegation. Actually, each time after the National Congress of CPC, there should be a delegation to DPRK, to Vietnam. But this it's a really very special moment for the Chinese, especially after at least one year standoff between China and the DPRK. I think the DPRK side accepted this delegation. This is a signal that China and the DPRK returned to the normal track to have a dialogue and negotiation on the issues related to DPRK and the Korean Peninsula.
I see. Mr. Pollack, not only China, but also the United States has sent an envoy, not to North Korea, of course not, but to South Korea, almost at the same time. What do you think could be the message? After all, the two presidents in the United States and China just met 2 weeks ago.
Well, as best we can judge, the visit of Song Tao has not resulted in any kind of major development. It might be, as was suggested, the resumption of some kind of bilateral contact with North Korea. But from the Xinhua statement released within the last hour, it seems increasingly clear that there was no meeting with Kim Jong-un. There were meetings with several very senior leaders, but I don't see this as a breakthrough. I see this as a kind of a minimum kind of consultation that has been undertaken. And if anyone was expecting something larger, in particular if the United States was expecting something larger, I don't think it's materialized.
Well, when you are saying whether the United States is expecting something larger, there is a quote that we have of President Trump praising China for sending Song and his team. He tweeted this: China is sending an envoy and delegation to North Korea, a big move. We'll see what happens, end of quote. Whether one visit would overall change the picture, that probably is too optimistic for anyone. But Mr. Pollack, my question to you also is about the United States sending an envoy almost at the same time to South Korea as well, and also there were positive messages, seems, from South Korea, so-called importing mineral water coming from the north for so-called religious reasons, whatever the issue is. But after all, everybody seemed to make a little move there. Mr. Pollack.
Well, I think the overall atmosphere has cooled a little. President Trump's words were less angry than usual on his visit. But I must say, when I see what North Korea continues to report, even within the last several days, about their thinking about President Trump, their thinking about the United States, their convictions about their nuclear weapons program, I see very, very little reason to be at all even remotely optimistic that we are near any kind of a change, other than in a very narrow tactical sense. It's better than nothing at all, but it's not something at this point that looks very big.
Professor Lee, it really up to the interpretation as to the expectation and the so-called the nature of change. After all, the DPRK has already developed its nuclear program. After all, it's already got its very advanced missile program to send those nuclear things into the outer space and probably will reach the United States. So what is the nature of expectation that we should have right now, Professor Lee?
And after all, North Korea this year alone has been able to condition much of the world that constant bluster, continual missile and even nuclear tests are just a fact of life. So the fact that we have had no provocation, no major weapons test for more than 60 days now since North Korea's latest, the last missile test on September 15th, creates unreasonable expectations. I believe the U.S. Special Representative for North Korea Policy, Ambassador Yoon's visit to Seoul, was to consult with South Korean and other allies in the region what the next move may be that North Korea has now been more self-restrained. It's alliance management, like President Xi's special envoy's visit to North Korea. It's just managing relations. Of course, Kim Jong-un played hard to get whenever you had a high-profile foreign visitor, like the former U.S. President Jimmy Carter and others visiting Pyongyang. There's no reason for a head of state to have actually granted an audience with someone who's below cabinet level as the special envoy was. So it was routine diplomatic engagement, but of course the fundamental dynamic in the Korean Peninsula under which North Korea continues to expand, increase its nuclear capability, that has not changed at all.
Mr. Teng, therefore, besides the visit by the special envoy, Mr. Song Tao, to DPRK, what's likely? Let's just say it's minor contact between the two sides, but that means the resumption of contact between the two sides. What might be some of the follow-up steps?
From China, I think the Chinese government insisted is a long-standing position that denuclearization, peace and stability in the peninsula, and all the disputes should be solved through dialogue and negotiation. These are the three principles for Chinese government in dealing with DPRK nucleus. And as for DPRK, I don't think at this moment Kim Jong-un will give any compromise in developing its nuclear and missile capability. DPRK has already almost reached the terminal station to get the nuclear bomb and the missile or the delivery system of the bomb. So I think at this moment, Kim Jong-un will never give any compromise in this regard. This is a well-determined policy for DPRK.
It is their life-saving policy, as Mr. Kim has been repeatedly told to the international community. Mr. Pollack, though, on that circumstances, in fact, it's a set of realities all of you have been illustrated very clearly. What could be the steps coming from the United States? Still refusing of the fact that the DPRK has already developed quite some program, it is already almost getting there, or come up with some kinds of steps in order to reach a possibility for dialogue?
Well, I think that there's a small window possibly connected with the upcoming Winter Olympics to be held in the Republic of Korea, where you might see some kind of a dampening down of possible activities, but that probably would be very momentary. I think it's important to emphasize North Korea is not making any claim about this being a halt in its activities. It may simply be a pause until the next stage of their missile and nuclear development. So unless we see some kind of a signal emanating from North Korea, I think that the United States will sustain its current policy of pressure with signals of engagement only to the extent that there is reason to believe that engagement will be for a meaningful purpose. And at that level, I think, although there are some voices in the Trump administration, including Mr. Yoon, Ambassador Yoon, who are trying to leave that door open a little, it's not something that I would consider a possibility of a major shift in U.S. direction. But having said that, I think that that anything that enables us to buy time and to avoid an overt military conflict would be a plus, a very big plus.
Professor Lee, it is not the first time, not the second time, not the third time, not even the fourth time that I heard over and over again from some American scholars. worrying about the prospect that the administration's possible decision about whether to use military power to intervene into the issue of the Korean Peninsula. Of course, everybody understands the danger of it and the implications it's likely to have in the region. Professor Lee, are you worried?
Yes, because a war in the Korean Peninsula would be simply devastating. The loss of innocent lives in the hundreds of thousands or millions, that's an inconceivable conception. There is a good reason that the U.S. has not, at any time since the end of the Korean War in 1953, used military force against North Korea, even when attacked by North Korea, even when North Koreans killed American soldiers and South Koreans, for fear of a humanitarian disaster of that kind. So I'm still cautiously optimistic that the Trump administration knows the difference between having a plan, preparing for a contingency, and actually executing it. You know, President Trump spoke very strongly when addressing the South Korean National Assembly. He laid out in detail a litany of North Korean human rights violations, from the state policy of starving its own people to the insidious political class system, infanticide, and so on. And that got North Korea to declare that Trump is a lunatic, that his bacteria, cockroach, crazy, deranged daughter, and so forth. And I think that kind of rhetorical escalation we can expect next week, when I believe President Trump or the State Department will relist North Korea as a state sponsor of terrorism.
I see. Mr. Teng, though, close neighbor of DPRK, of course, China is forever against any military intervention on the issue. But sometimes things could get out of control as China has its own contingency plan. Of course, exercising is another thing. Meanwhile, Mr. Teng, China talk about double suspension. Are we getting any closer to that possibility, Mr. Teng?
No, I don't think in that way. Actually, China is now facing a dilemma in security and also in diplomacy dealing with the DPRK nuclear issue. I'm sure Donald Trump, during recent visit, has learned something from the dealing with the DPRK, and his policy may be a maximum pressure on DPRK, but I think if you look at the differences between China and the United States toward DPRK, we can find some gaps in this regard. For example, the United States insists on that every choice should be on the table, but China always insists that no use of military in dealing with the DPRK nuclear. So I think this is a big gap between China and the United States, and the two countries, I'm sure, have discussed the possibility to cooperate in recent visit by President Donald Trump. But I don't think the 100% in favor of all the choices on the table. They have to try the best to dealing with the challenge, because the nuclear and the missile capability in DPRK has already become direct and real. When real and direct threat toward the United States, especially to the mainland of the United States, I'm sure the U.S. leaders will take it seriously.
Mr. Pollack, of course, when we talk about international issues, one of the most important things to do is to look at domestic calendar. If you look at the American domestic calendar, is the midterm election already. President Trump did not viewed favorably by the media, nor did he was viewed by his party that well. So given all of these circumstances, what kind of balance do you think, understanding his personality, he's likely to take as the president? Once again, I repeat, as the president of the United States, Mr. Pollack.
Well, I think that he is facing some acute domestic political pressures. I suspect that that is going to continue for a long period of time. It will weaken his ability to act, I think, on many major international issues. On the other hand, he may believe that given the commitments he has made, the insistence that he says that North Korea will not achieve this capability, it could alternatively lead him to double down to some extent and to increase pressure or to take other kinds of actions. I understand it's all very, very speculative, but this is a man who is very preoccupied by his domestic circumstances right now. They do not look good at all, and that is going to affect what he is able to do on a wider international scene. He considered his visit a big, big success, but others are not so confident about a lot of that.
Mr. Teng and Professor Lee, if what Mr. Pollack analyzed is the reality, that means pressure for China, of course, coming over from the U.S. side when things are getting worse in the near future, if there were. And then also for South Korea, that the United States might not be able to so-called meet the expectations of Seoul. So what would that mean for the two countries, Mr. Teng? Is China ready to react and interact among all of these players when further pressure is coming, whether from Washington or some of the others?
Yeah, actually, China has been a mediator for decades in dealing with DPRK nuclear. China, I'm sure, should play a role in this game because any clash in this region will cause the deterioration of the situation in our neighboring countries, and I think the peace and stability in our neighboring countries should be the condition for China's domestic development. And we have already established the final strategy toward the future, especially toward 2050. So this is a very important step. This is a very important condition for China to maintain the peace and stability in Korean Peninsula. So if we have any clash in that region, I'm sure China will stop its development domestically. So China should enhance its cooperation with ROK, with Japan, with the United States, and even with Russia. So this is very important for all the parties concerned to have more consensus in dealing with this issue.
When you are talking about cooperate, of course, it takes two parties to tango when you talk about cooperation. Professor Lee, what about your thought about South Korea's fate in the future? Is it more likely to be so-called nurtured and protected by the United States, or mainly South Korea's voices is likely to fall into deaf ears?
Well, South Korea's role is rather limited, unfortunately, which is ironic because it's the nation that faces the greatest risk from North Korean belligerents. South Korea is keen on keeping an equidistant a policy of equidistance vis-a-vis the U.S. and China. The new rubric under Moon Jae-in is now balanced diplomacy. So South Korea is caught in the middle between two great powers. Now, speaking of the domestic calendar, not the political calendar, but the general calendar, we now know, the world recognizes that North Korea does a major provocation. It tends to on a major national holiday, both theirs as well as Chinese, American Independence Day, Memorial Day, Chinese Lunar New Year's Day, and so forth. And we have a major holiday coming up in the United States, Thanksgiving Day. In 2010, North Korea shelled the South Korean island 2 days shy of Thanksgiving Day. So if North Korea were to resort to a major provocation in the remaining time of this calendar year, 2017, it could come as early as next week or maybe in December. And then the Chinese role in terms of restraining North Korea, in terms of playing a more proactive, constructive role in keeping the peace in the region will become all the more important.
Things are always tricky, whether you have made enormous efforts or not, sometimes probably even more. We'll see how things are going. But for now, I want to thank the three of you helping us to understand different perspectives. Teng Jianqun, Sung-Yoon Lee, Jonathan Pollack. Really appreciate, gentlemen, for being with us. Thank you so much.